We'll be studying the book of Habakkuk in here tonight. If you do not have one of the outlines, and I see we have some visitors here, and we do have extra outlines available. If you'd like one, if you raise your hand, we'll see that you get it. Actually, you'll get a bonus because we've got about 3 or 4 books stapled together, so you can have the outlines of previous lessons as well. All right, we're continuing our study of the matter of redemption through the Bible, looking especially in the Old Testament, and in some cases, some books have references and prophecies relative to future events that relate to us, especially the establishment of the church, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, other things that would relate to us as the redeemed today. But beyond that, we can see from a study of these Old Testament books how God dealt with His people then, and will give us some insight on how God will deal with His people today. Those who are serving God faithfully can expect the same kind of blessing from God that they received under the Old Testament system, and those who are disobedient today can expect the same reaction, same response from God as was found relative to those who sinned under the Old Testament system. That's why Paul would say in Romans 15:4, whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning. They're not written for our law, they're written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scripture, might have hope. And so among those Old Testament books is this one among the minor prophets that we refer to as Habakkuk. Now, as far as Habakkuk personally is concerned, we know very little about him. To my knowledge, we know nothing about his parents. We know nothing about his birth. We know little about him except his name, which is given to us in chapter 1 and verse 1, and he is referred to as a prophet, both in chapter 1 and verse 1, and then again in chapter 3 and verse 1. He is referred to as a prophet. Beyond that, we really know nothing else about him. His name, or that is the name Habakkuk, means to embrace. As we look at the book, we're going to find that it's a very unique, very different book as relating to the other books of prophecy that we have already studied and will study later on. Looking at the outline, we've noted that through the book of Habakkuk, we continue to see God's concern with other nations. For example, the book of Obadiah that we've already studied, there was concern for the nation of Edom. As a matter of fact, Obadiah prophesied concerning the destruction of Edom because of their disobedience. Nahum, a book that we studied 2 weeks ago, had to do with the fate of Assyria or Nineveh. And we noted quite a contrast in that book between the book of Nahum and what other book specifically? The book of Jonah. Because both of those books, Jonah and Nahum, dealt with the city of Nineveh and the nation of Assyria. And unlike Jonah's day, where they repented at the preaching of Jonah, they did not repent at the preaching of Nahum. When we come to the book of Habakkuk, we're going to deal, at least in part, with the fate of the nation of Babylon. Now, when we look at the book itself, and there's some indications within the book as to the time of the writing of the book. As we noted in the outline, written shortly after the fall of Nineveh. Now, it's interesting when you go back and look at the nations and the rise and fall of nations during this particular time period. Because when you think about specifically the nation of Israel, that is a reference to the northern 10 tribes, who took them into captivity? Assyria, exactly. The Assyrian armies took them captive. When did that happen, approximately? Can't pull that one up right now?
Number 755 comes up.
That was before your time. Okay, well, must have been just a few years ago then. 721 is the date that's usually given. Now, there were some other battles that led up to that, and Jim, that may be where you're coming from in that regard a little earlier. But the date that's usually given as the ultimate fall of the nation of Israel is 721. Now, of course, what nation then takes Judah captive? Babylon. Now, during the time between Assyria taking Israel captive and Babylon taking Judah captive, Babylon actually overcomes Assyria. You may recall in Daniel's prophecy the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had with regarding those nations, those beginning, and he said to Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar was king of what? Babylon. And he said, "Thou art that head of gold." And so it begins with him. And then you have the Medo-Persian, the Grecian, the Roman kingdoms. And what's happening there is one nation after another is rising up and taking over some of these others that thought they were invincible. How were they able to do that? Who's in control? God is in control. And so sometimes I think we forget that, and that's one of the things that we'll find interesting in this regard. So Habakkuk here begins really talking about the nation of Judah. And he's ultimately going to talk about the nation of Babylon. So that's why both of them are mentioned in this regard. So it's written just prior to the invasion of Judah by the armies of Babylon. You'll notice in chapter 3 and in verse 16, he said, "When I heard, my belly trembled, my lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered into my bones, and I trembled in myself, that I might rest in the day of trouble. When he cometh up unto the people, he will invade them with his troops." If you go back and study that, he's looking to the time, and of course, God is explaining to Habakkuk here, really giving an answer to his first question. And his first question was, why are you letting such wickedness prevail in Judah? And God says, well, let me show you something. I'll show you something that you would thought you would have never seen in your lifetime. And he shows him by way of vision the coming in of the Babylonian army. And Habakkuk trembled, scared him to death when God showed him about what was about to happen. And so then he turns and has another quibble, and we'll get to all of that as we develop this study. But turn back to 2 Kings chapter 23 just a minute. In 2 Kings chapter 23, in verse 34 and following, you'll find reference to Jehoiakim, who was king of God's people at this point. And Jehoiakim gave the silver and the gold of Pharaoh, but he taxed the land to give the money according to the commandment of Pharaoh. He exacted the silver and the gold of the people of the land, of everyone according to his taxation, to give it unto Pharaoh Necho. You come on down to verse 37, still talking about Jehoiakim. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. And so it's during the reign of Jehoiakim that apparently Habakkuk was prophesying and dealing with the nation of Judah. So it was a very wicked time in their history. He was one of the most godless kings of the people of that day. Now, keeping that particular thought in mind, you want to try to put some things together here. We've already gone through the book of Jeremiah, and we're probably more familiar with Jeremiah than we are Habakkuk. But according to the time frame that seems to be the case, they would have been contemporaries. They would have been working at the same time period, if you please, trying to work with God's people in that regard. In verse 1, you find the phrase, the burden, which Habakkuk the prophet did see. The word burden there simply means oracle. Here is what God is showing Habakkuk that's going to come to pass relative to Judah first at the hands of Babylon, and then Babylon later on in that regard. Now as you look at verses 2 through 4, and we note this in the outline, Habakkuk seems to have a problem making sense out of what's happening. He travels down a very difficult road of faith, if you please. Seeing all that's taking place, O Lord, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Even cry out unto thee of violence, and thou wilt not save? Why dost thou show me iniquity, cause me to behold grievance? For spoiling and violence are before me, and there are that raise up strife and contention. Therefore the law is slacked, and judgment doth never go forth. For the wicked doth compass about the righteous, therefore wrong judgment proceedeth. What's Habakkuk say? Lord, I don't understand. Why are you allowing this kind of situation to continue in Judah? I mean, violence, grievous things are happening here. Spoiling, violence, strife, contention, slacking relative to the law. Righteous judgment is not even known. What does he seem to be saying? God, or do you not care anymore? I mean, I thought you were a God that hated these kinds of things. Why are you allowing them to continue in that regard? And then we'll see that a little bit more later on. Point E in the introduction, one of the unique features of the book, the other prophets plead with the people on behalf of God. In other words, their work, the work of the other prophets, they're going to the people saying, repent, taking a message from God to the people. But Habakkuk pleads with God on behalf of the people. Really what you have in the book of Habakkuk is somewhat of a complaint-answer scenario. Habakkuk complains, and God gives him an answer. We'll look more into that a little bit later. Then I want us to look at just skip over point 1 right now. If we have time, we'll come back to that, but there's some other things that I want to cover, especially under this basic outline section here, and then some of the lessons. But looking at the basic outline, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, why is sin being tolerated in Judah? Is God oblivious to current events? No. Take a look at 2 or 3 other passages, if you will. Go back to the book of Judges. Judges chapter 6 and in verse 13, if you want to turn back there, if you want to just listen to the reading of it. Gideon said unto the Lord, unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? What's he saying? God, are you not concerned about what's happening among your own people? Well, that's basically what Habakkuk is asking, isn't it? God, are you not concerned about what's happening among your people? And where be all his miracles, which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us, and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. Same kind. God, are you not with us? You ever have that problem in your own life? Things happen in your life and you think, where is God in all of it? How could such things happen in my life? Well, then you look at Job. Job 21 and in verse 7. Wherefore do the wicked live, become old, yea, are mighty in power? How can God let this thing happen? Same sentiment as expressed by Habakkuk. Then in Jeremiah chapter 12. Jeremiah chapter 12 and verse 1. Righteous art thou, O Lord, when I plead with thee, yet let me walk with thee of thy judgments, or let me talk with thee of thy judgments. Wherefore doth the way of the wicked prosper? Wherefore are all they happy that deal very treacherously? God, I need to talk to you about the way you're handling this thing. That's what Jeremiah says. So you see, this is not the only time here in the book of Habakkuk that we find God's operation, if you please, being questioned even by his own prophets. In Revelation chapter 6, the souls of those who had been beheaded for the cause of Christ were seen by John around the altar crying what? How long, O Lord, holy and true, until our blood be avenged on the earth? Lord, how long are you going to let this go on? Can you relate to these people? Job, Jeremiah, Habakkuk, those souls? Can you relate to that in your own life? I suspect that we can. Things don't always run really smooth with us, do they? And sometimes we might ask, well, if God is such a loving, caring God, and I'm his child, and I'm striving to live a faithful life, how could this happen to me? Well, we'll see an answer to that here in just a little bit. You see, an interesting observation here to me in this regard is Habakkuk states his problem to God. He doesn't allow it to become the source of disbelief. Well, if that's the God you want to present to me, then I don't want any part of it. Oh, that's not. But that's the way a lot of people in the world react, isn't it? If that's the kind of God you're going to present to me that will allow all of these evil things to happen, then I don't want any part of that God. When the children of Israel were coming out of Egypt, the leadership of Moses, where was there, I think, if I recall correctly, where was their first point of complaint? Red Sea. Before or after the Red Sea? Before. What's happened? Well, we're on the banks of the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's army is right on our duster. What's their question? Were there not enough graves in Egypt? You brought us out here to die. Complaining about God's plan. But what did Moses say to them on that occasion? Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Now there's your answer whenever things don't seem to be going right. And you wonder about, why is God letting all of this? Well, just stand still. Just be quiet for a while. Don't question God. Don't challenge God. Just sit still or stand still and see what God has in store for you on down the road. Who knows? That was the response then. In Numbers chapter 9, and in verse 8, you have Moses again. Moses said unto them, stand still, and I will hear what the Lord will command concerning you. So that's the second time that he's had to tell these people, now you just got to exercise more patience. Look in the book of Joshua, chapter 3, and in verse 8. Well, let's look at verse 7 as well. The Lord said unto Joshua, this day will I begin to magnify thee in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. And thou shalt command the priests that bear the ark of the covenant, saying, when ye come to the brink of the water of Jordan, ye shall what? Stand still in Jordan. Because God's got something He wants to show you. I mean, that's the rest of the story. It's not stated in that verse, but that's what it amounts to. And you could just, 1 Samuel, let's look at one other passage or two, and then we'll move on from this. But I think this is so crucial to us when we become impatient and when we begin to doubt and when we begin to question all of the bad things that may be happening in our lives. In 1 Samuel chapter 12 and in verse 7, now therefore stand still, that I may reason with you before the Lord of all the righteous acts of the Lord, which He did to you and to your fathers. And you go back and you look at the context, and basically what is being said here, what Samuel is saying to the people here is, you need a refresher course in what God has done for His people in the past. Just stand still, and let me talk to you about that a little bit. Now, you can go to other passages, chapter 14 of 1 Samuel, Job chapter 37. There are other passages that give you that same answer. And again, I say, I think that is so crucial when you're dealing with God and when God is dealing with the redeemed. Do we ever become impatient? God, give me patience and right now. I want it now. There may come a time in our lives where bad things will happen. And we just need to be patient enough to say, okay, I don't understand this. I don't understand why God's letting this happen. But I'm not going to give up on God. And what you'll see in the closing part of this book of Habakkuk is an unyielding, unmovable faith on the part of Habakkuk relative to God. And that's what we need, folks, as God's redeemed. Don't allow external circumstances that come our way to destroy our faith. Don't let it be a source of disbelief. But go back and look at these Old Testament segments of Scripture. These things were written for our learning, remember? Stand still. Just be patient. See what God has in store for you on down the road. You know, I've gone through some circumstances in the past relative to local congregations and preaching and so forth. And I'm like, I just simply don't understand. I mean, this is awful. Why does this kind of thing happen? And then the next thing you know, I find myself in a place like Bremen, Georgia. Don't shake your head. Listen, it may be that way for you, but it's this way for me. What does God have in store for us? Something maybe far better than what we would have had we stayed where we were. So let's don't give up on God so quick. So when you look at Habakkuk and you see his frustration, you see his lack of understanding, why God is allowing this thing, why is sin being tolerated? Judah here is steeped in sin, and God seems to remain idle relative to it. But that's just not the case, is it? In verses 5 through 11, and we're not going to have time to look at all of it in that much detail, but I just think that is so crucial for us to see that major point out of the book of Habakkuk. When we don't understand things, don't get antsy, don't get to the point of disbelief, don't begin to doubt God. Just stand still and see what God has in store. But then the Lord's reply in verses 5 through 11 of chapter 1 is basically this. I'm going to raise up Babylon to punish Judah. They're not going to get away with this forever. Babylon's going to come in and take them over, take them down, if you please, because of their wickedness. And he describes that. They are terrible and dreadful, verse 7. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. And he goes ahead and talks about what's going to happen in that regard. But then you come to chapter 2 and verse 1, he said, I will stand upon my watch and set me upon the tower, and will watch to see what he will say unto me, and what I shall answer when I am reproved. Now the Lord said unto me, write in a vision. You see, Habakkuk's problem now is, if God is going to use Babylon to punish Judah, how in the world could God do that? How could God use a nation that is far more wicked than his own people to punish his own people? You see, he's perplexed, number one, because sin is being allowed to continue in Egypt, and when God says, here's the solution to that, Babylon's going to take care of that. Then his second point of being perplexed is, how could God use a heathen nation like Babylon to do that? Well, in chapter 2, Babylon will be punished in time. You see, God doesn't always do everything on our schedule, does he? We'd like for him to, but he doesn't. In chapter 2, there are 5 woes. And time permitting, we'll look at those in the next section of this. But that's basically what you have in chapter 2, verses 2 through 20. And then chapter 3, verses 1 through 19, you have Habakkuk's prayer of confident faith in the Lord. It's interesting in chapter 3 and in verse 2, O Lord, I have heard thy speech. And what? And was afraid. Have you ever been guilty of saying, man, I wish I knew what was going to happen the next 6 months of my life? I don't understand what's happening right now. I wish I could see on down the road a little bit. You ever thought that? You're probably not completely human if you haven't thought that at some point or another. Yeah. Yeah. What's down the road 6 months? Well, the truth being, if God were to show us what was down the road 6 months, it might scare us to death. It might give us a heart attack, you know. So what do? Back to our answer. Stand still. Don't lose confidence. Don't lose faith. Don't lose trust in God. But God has promised relative to the redeemed, He's there. He's there. He's never forsaken His people. Then some of the basic lessons that we don't have a lot of time to cover here. First of all, you have the supremacy of God in chapter 2 and in verse 20. But the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him. And you'll find that same sentiment expressed in Psalm 11. But this may be one of the more familiar verses in the book of Habakkuk to us. So it shows us the supremacy of God, and you've got other points in that regard. But the point that I would make relative to that is, let all the earth keep silence before Him. Who is amenable or accountable to the law of God? Everybody. Everybody. It is so unfortunate that especially in the realm of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, some have come up with the idea that those who are not Christians are not amenable to the law of God relative to divorce and remarriage. So before you become a Christian, you can marry and divorce and remarry 15 times if you want to. But then when you become a Christian, all of that is of no more concern to God, because those people are not amenable to the law of God. Well, they have not studied their Bibles very carefully. Every person is amenable to the law of God, and every person will ultimately give an account of how he has lived his life on this earth. And the law of God is going to be the standard by which that will take place. Now, if they're not amenable to it, if people who are not Christians are not amenable to the law of God, then you know the best thing we as the church could do? Lock our doors, shut our mouths, and never say another word to a lost person. Because the moment we convert them to Christ, they have become amenable to the law of God. If that were the case, it's not. If they're not amenable to the law of God, why in the world are we trying to convert them? Doesn't make any sense. But yet that's the position that even some of our own brethren have taken, to try to get around God's law on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Let all the earth keep silence. Then we've talked about, or have noticed, a divine discipline, point B, in that regard. Point C, the self-destructiveness of evil. And that's where we mentioned the 5 woes that are mentioned. Chapter 2 and verse 6, he basically says, he who plunders shall be plundered. When you look at chapter 2 and verse 6, and I wish we had time to look at each of these woes in detail, but time won't permit. But he talks about woe to him that increaseth that which is not his. What's happened with Babylon? They have increased with goods, but where did they get the goods? From somebody else. They took stuff that did not belong to them. So he says, woe to him that has done that. In chapter 2 and verse 9, he who is covetous, thinking only of himself, forfeits his own soul. It's interesting here, you'll notice, woe to him that coveteth an evil covetousness to his house, that he may set his nest on high. That little phrase, set his nest on high. You'll find a similar expression back in Jeremiah chapter 49 relative to Edom. And the point that is being made here is, We are a fortified place. It's like a nest setting up on high that the wild animals can't get. We are so strong, we are set so high, nobody can bring us down. Now that may be true as far as nation against nation is concerned. But who's in control? God's in control. They thought they couldn't be brought down. Chapter 2 and verse 12, he who oppresses, his town shall be destroyed. Notice what he says in that, woe to him that buildeth a town with blood and establisheth a city by iniquity. What's happened here? They have built their cities by violence and with captive labor, if you please. What's going to happen to those cities that they have built in that way? They're going to be brought down. They're going to be destroyed. Chapter 2 and verse 15, he who reduces people to helplessness shall ultimately be the same. Woe unto him that giveth his neighbor drink, that puttest thy bottle to him, and makest him drunken also. Thou mayest look on their nakedness. Thou art filled with shame for glory. So you have been responsible for making your neighbors helpless. What's going to happen to Babylon? God's going to put them in the same position at some point. They will be helpless. Chapter 2 and verse 19, he who is idolatrous will be spiritually lost. Woe unto him that saith to the wood, awake, to the dumb stone, arise. Can you imagine? These little gods hewn out of stone or wood. We expect them to speak. All of those statues of Buddha. I wonder how many of them can talk. Well, none of them can talk. They're nothing but false gods. And there are a lot of other false gods besides Buddha in the world. But he says to those people, behold, it is laid over with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in the midst. It's just not there. You can call on it to talk all day. Does that remind you of anybody else who called on their God and never got an answer? Oh, yeah. Whenever Elijah got the prophets of Baal together and offered them the first opportunity, call on your God. If He's really God, get Him to answer. How long did they work try to get Him to answer? All day, and they got rather violent about it toward the end of the day, didn't they? Actually got up on the altars shouting and stomping and crying and cutting themselves. Altars had to be rebuilt before Elijah could call upon God to prove Himself to be God. So that's the way. Anything that we turn to besides God is nothing but a dumb idol. And so the self-destructiveness of evil. Yes, Babylon's going to be brought in to bring God's people to its knees. But then in turn, they will be overrun on down the road. Then there is the certainty of justice that we can learn from this book, and this is somewhat of an overlap, but there's certain doom to the sinful. In Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8, Paul said, be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 7 and following, and to you who are troubled, rest with us. What's going to happen to the troublers? You that are troubled, rest with us. When the Lord Jesus shall be revealed from heaven with His mighty angels in flaming fire, taking vengeance on them who know not God and obey not the gospel, who shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of His power. There's the troubler. There's the end result of the troubler. Then point E, you have the ideal of the gospel, and you look at chapter 2 and verse 14, and the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. What is the Great Commission all about? Filling the world with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. That's what we're all about. Getting that gospel message to every creature. Go into all nations, preach the gospel to every creature. And we need to take this commandment seriously. Then out of that, great faith can emerge from doubt. If we'll just stand still, continue to be faithful to God, allow God to do what God's going to do in our lives, through us, and our faith will be stronger. You contrast Habakkuk the doubter with Habakkuk the convinced. You look at Habakkuk in the first part of chapter 1, and you look at Habakkuk in the closing part of chapter 3, and you'll see a totally different Habakkuk. Because God has convinced him, and his faith has remained strong. Then you have other examples there, Psalm 42, verses 3 and 11. Then you have a reference to Jeremiah, his doubting but was assured of God. Thomas doubted. What did he say? I'm not going to believe that the Lord has come forth from that grave till I see what? Till I see the prints in his hand and the spear mark in his side. What did the Lord say? Here it is. Then what did he say? Something about my Lord and my God. He was convinced. Doubting? So does that say anything to us about doubt? Is it sinful? Is it wrong to doubt? You know, I hear people say, boy, my faith is getting so weak. I'm just not as strong. Is that sinful? No, not unless it leads you away from God. It's only human. Because we don't know the mind of God. We can't see 6 months or 6 years down the road. That's why we have to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord in whatever our trouble is. And then that doubt that we had will become strong. There is courage, time of crisis, chapter 3. Faith, the guarantee of permanence, chapter 2 and verse 4. God's ways are not our ways. We talked about that a little bit on Sunday. And then God abideth faithful. You'll never find an occasion of where God has ever gone back on His word. Not once. Now there have been conditional prophecies where God didn't do what He said He was going to do because the people repented, such as in the case of Nineveh. But you'll never find a time where God has gone back on His word. We need that lesson in our lives tonight. When we read passages like Romans 8, if God be for us, who can be against us? We know that all things work together for good to those that love God, to those who are the called according to His purpose. We need that, don't we? Because there are times in our lives that when we have a tendency to doubt. But the answer to it is, stand still. Stand still. Wait on the Lord. Don't become impatient. Allow God time to work things out to His good pleasure. Yeah.